In this video, we will talk about organizational structure. This video is based on Chapter 2 um, in the book Educational Administration Concepts and Practices, written by Lunenburg and Ornstein and published in 2011 by Cengage Learning. We will talk about 7 key elements that need to be addressed when thinking about or designing the organizational structure of any organization and, of course, educational organizations, such as first, job specialization, second, departmentalization, third, chain of command, fourth, authority and responsibility, fifth, centralization and decentralization, next, line and staff authority, and finally, number 7, span of management. So, organizational structure provides a framework for vertical control and horizontal coordination of any organization, including educational organizations such as schools and universities, etc. And as we mentioned earlier, there are 7 key elements that any, school administrator needs to address when they design their organizational structure. And so we will talk about the 7 key elements one by one. Let's begin with job specialization. So job specialization is a basic concept of organizational structure, which answers the following important design question: to what degree are activities subdivided into separate jobs? Right? One of the main things, main components of an organizational structure is to divide the work to be done, into specialized tasks and to organize them into specific units, right? There are an example of job specialization could be a division of a big school into elementary, middle, and high school units, right? Or in any school or university, the division into administrative and teaching functions. Or, for example, a division into of positions, according to the law, as the law requires it. For example, having a position of superintendent, a principal, etc. Right? And in addition to job specialization, there are also some alternatives, right? So, as a school administrator, one could divide the activities that need to be accomplished into separate jobs by using either job rotation, job enlargement, or job enrichment, right? So let's briefly talk about each of them. Job rotation, involves, moving employees systematically from one job to another. And very often, for example, in large school districts in the US, principals might be rotated between schools every 5 years. So that is job rotation, right? Another alternative to job specialization is job enlargement, right? Uh, Job enlargement adds, more, breadth to a job performed by adding, more and more of various activities to be performed by an employee. Okay, so finally, job enrichment. This is when, depth rather than breadth is added to a job. So, for example, teaching. A person who mostly does the teaching could be, could have more administrative activities, which would involve some decision making, participation in budgeting or staffing, so that's an example of job enrichment. The second element of an organizational structure, departmentalization, answers the following key design question: on what basis will jobs be grouped together? Okay, so this is really basically an organization-wide division of work, and it helps to to realize the benefits of job specialization, and actually, in addition to that, coordinate activities of all the parts of the organization, right? So, for example, you know, there could be, in an educational organization, there could be divisions of instruction, business, personnel, research and development, right? And for example, in an instruction division, right, there could be subdivisions like departments of English, math, social studies, etc. And in schools, the most common grouping is by function. So, really, this functional departmentalization has a lot of advantages. Well, people who perform similar functions usually work together. So, each unit could be staffed by experts in this particular functional area, right? And therefore, decision making and coordination kind of become easier because, division administrators or department heads, they only have to know only like a relatively narrow set of things, right? And also, functional departments could use the resources more efficiently because the department's activity doesn't have to be repeated across several school district divisions, right? At the same time, functional departmentalization has some disadvantages. For example, because this is function based, people can develop overly narrow and overly technical points of view and kind of forget or lose the sight of the greater system perspective, right? And often communication and coordination across departments can become a little bit more challenging, and there might be even conflicts as each department will try to protect their own area of responsibility and authority. So there are both advantages and disadvantages, but really function-based grouping is very common in educational organizations. The third key element of an organizational structure is chain of command, and it answers the following key design question: to whom do individuals and groups report? And overall, chain of command it deals with the flow of authority and responsibility within an organization, and it is related to two underlying principles. The first, unity of command. So the unity of command is basically the idea that a subordinate is accountable only to one person from whom he or she receives authority and responsibility. Okay. The second principle is called scalar principle, and it basically means that the authority and responsibility should flow in a direct line vertically from top management to the lowest level, right? And examples, from an educational setting could be like from the university, university setting where there is a hierarchy within professional ranks. There are instructors, and then there are assistant professors, and there are associate professors, and there are full professors, right? So, that's one possible illustration of a chain of command from an educational institution. The fourth element of an organizational structure are authority and responsibility. Okay, so they answer these concepts, respond to the key design question: what is the framework for providing direction and control, right? And this towards authority refers to a right to make decisions and direct the work of others. And really, in an ideal world, authority and responsibility should be linked. Okay, so to give you an example, in a typical U.S. school district, authority, begins from the Board of Education, right? And then a Board of Education could then delegate the authority necessary to administer the school district to the superintendent of schools. And then the authority could be delegated further and further, right? And with every step in this delegation process, authority becomes narrower in scope. right? So each succeedingly lower level has narrower limits on the areas of legitimate authority. Okay. Next element that is important to understand when designing or analyzing an organizational structure is centralization, decentralization, right? And this element responds to the key design question: where does decision-making authority lie? Okay, so delegation of authority between a superior and subordinate is basically same thing as sharing power, right? And this at all these levels of an organizational structure, all this empowerment practices have cumulatively can have a dramatic effect on the organizational structure. Okay, so when a school district, a school, and any educational organization are decentralized, then more authority and responsibility are delegated to lower levels and more decisions are made at lower levels. Okay, and centralization, in contrast, means that school administrators tend to retain most authority and they expect that subordinates only implement decisions that were made by the people above them, by superordinates, right? And authority could be delegated, either to a smaller or a larger degree in the organization. In the recent decades, in the United States and even Canada, the trend has been that schools would be more decentralized, right? And in general, there are some advantages of decentralization, such as decentralization allows greater use of human resources available in the organization. It also unburdens top-level administrators, and because decisions are made closer to the firing line, they are made also by people with technical knowledge, with in-depth understanding of the local context. And finally, a decentralized organization in very often can make quicker responses to external changes. Okay. The next element we are going to talk about in the school, in the organizational structure, is line and staff authority. And this element answers the following design question: what type of authority flows in a direct line in the chain of command? And what type flows to line personnel in the form of advice? Okay, so in that question already you could see that line authority and staff authority differ. So line authority is the relationship in which a superior exercises direct supervision over a subordinate. For example, you could observe that kind of relationship between a superintendent and assistant superintendent of instruction, right? So a superintendent can actually can order the assistant superintendent of instruction, to for example implement some changes, some curriculum change, right? And in contrast, staff authority is just really advisory in nature, and personnel in a staff authority position, they create, develop, collect, analyze information, and then that flows to line personnel in the form of advice, right? So these are people usually in the positions such as assistant to, right, original manager, or another example is a legal counsel. These people advise, for example, the superintendent in some matters affecting the schools, but then that's only advice, right? Finally, the last element in the organizational structure is the span of management. And span of management responds to the following key design question: how many people can an administrator efficiently and effectively direct? right? And well, there is no well, this really is just a number of subordinates that report directly to a single supervisor, right? And there is no magic number there. There is no agreement on how many people can actually a single administrator effectively lead and direct. But in practice, what we observe that the number of people that one person directs tends to be larger at lower levels than at higher levels, right? And for example, there could be more than 50 teachers in an elementary school reporting to one single principal, right? When there are so many people reporting to one person, there are often like informal layers, which, like for example, informal team leaders that are responsible for certain groups of subjects. But overall, we can see that the number of subordinates is larger, tends to be larger at lower levels than at higher levels. This is figure 2.1 from chapter 2 in Lunenburg and Ornstein. You can find it on page 31, and it presents an organizational structure for a hypothetical school district. So you can see here the superintendent on top. Here's the line. Here's the assistant to the superintendent and legal counsel. We talked how these two positions have staff authority. They provide advice to the superintendent, but they cannot order superintendent. However, the superintendent has line authority over assistant superintendent of personnel, assistant superintendent of instruction, assistant superintendent of business, and assistant superintendent of research and development, right? And in turn, these people have a line authority over other positions. And somewhere here we find teachers, elementary teachers, secondary teachers, right? So this picture illustrates very nicely all the 7 components we talked about in this video.